Across 2 millennia of ancient Mesopotamian civilization, the deity known as Marduk would rise from the obscure patron god of a minor Sumerian settlement to become the supreme ruler of the Babylonian pantheon, the cosmic champion who defeated the primordial chaos dragon Tiamat in single combat, the divine architect who fashioned the heavens and earth from her dismembered corpse, the recipient of 50 sacred names that concentrated the powers of every other god within his singular divine person, and the theological prototype whose characteristics would echo through the later monotheistic traditions of Judaism, Christianity and Islam in ways that continue to fascinate scholars of comparative religion. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic composed in his honour, would become one of the most influential religious texts of the ancient world, read aloud each year during the Akitu festival in Babylon, while priests performed elaborate rituals that symbolically renewed the cosmic order and legitimized the authority of Babylonian kings who claimed to rule by Marduk's divine mandate. His temple complex, the Asagula, whose name meant the house whose top is high, would stand at the spiritual and political centre of one of antiquity's greatest cities, drawing pilgrims and tribute from across the ancient Near East, while housing a priesthood whose theological innovations shaped religious thought for centuries. The ziggurat associated with his worship, the Etemenanki, or foundation of heaven and earth, would rise above the Mesopotamian plain as one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world, inspiring later legends including the biblical Tower of Babel, while serving as a physical embodiment of the Babylonians' belief that their city occupied the sacred junction between the earthly and celestial realms. Yet in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, when the great Sumerian city-states of Ur, Uruk, Eridu, and Nippur dominated the political and religious landscape of southern Mesopotamia, the settlement that would become Babylon was merely a modest provincial town on the banks of the Euphrates River, and its local deity Marduk commanded neither the cosmic authority nor the widespread devotion that would later characterize his worship. The theological transformation that would elevate this minor city god to supreme divine status represents one of the most remarkable examples of religious evolution in human history, a process intimately connected to the political fortunes of the city he protected and the ambitions of the dynasty that claimed his special favour. This is the story of Marduk, son of Ea, champion of the gods, slayer of Tiamat, and architect of the created order, from his origins as the local patron of an insignificant Babylonian settlement, through his theological elevation during the rise of the old Babylonian Empire under Hammurabi and his successors, his cosmic triumph over primordial chaos, as narrated in the Enuma Elish, the accumulation of his 50 divine names that represented the absorption of powers from the entire Mesopotamian pantheon, and the enduring influence of his theological characteristics on later religious traditions that would shape human spirituality long after the last Babylonian priest performed the final rituals in the Esagila, and the great city itself crumbled into the desert sands. The world into which Marduk emerged as a divine figure was shaped by religious traditions stretching back to the earliest periods of Mesopotamian civilization, when the Sumerians first developed the complex theological systems that would provide the foundation for all subsequent religious developments in the region. The Sumerian pantheon represented one of humanity's earliest sophisticated attempts to understand and categorize divine power, organizing the gods into hierarchies and family relationships that reflected both cosmic functions and political realities on Earth. At the apex of this divine hierarchy stood the great gods who controlled the fundamental forces of existence, including Anu the sky god, Enlil the lord of wind and storms who served as the chief executive deity, and Enki, known in Akkadian as Ea, the god of wisdom, magic, and the subterranean freshwater ocean called the Apsu. These supreme deities commanded the worship of multiple city-states and maintained elaborate temple establishments served by specialized priesthoods whose theological speculations continuously refined and developed Mesopotamian religious thought. The Sumerian religious system operated on the fundamental assumption that each city possessed its own patron deity whose fortunes were intimately linked to those of the human community that worshipped them. The patron god of Nippur was Enlil, whose temple the Eka served as the most prestigious religious establishment in Sumer, and whose blessing was considered essential for legitimate kingship. The ancient city of Eridu claimed Enki as its divine protector, maintaining traditions that identified this location as the site where kingship first descended from heaven and civilization began. Uruk honoured the goddess Inanna. known in later Akkadian tradition as Ishtar, whose cult combined aspects of love, sexuality and warfare in a complex theological synthesis that fascinated and sometimes troubled later observers. Each of these city-states maintained that its patron deity held particular cosmic responsibilities, and that the welfare of the divine patron and the human city were inseparably connected, a theological framework that would prove crucial for understanding Marduk's later rise to supremacy. The settlement that would become Babylon occupied a position along the Euphrates River, in the region where the Tigris and Euphrates approach most closely before diverging toward the Persian Gulf. Archaeological evidence suggests that this location was inhabited from at least the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era, though the site remained politically and religiously insignificant compared to the great Sumerian cities that dominated the southern alluvial plain. The earliest references to Babylon appear in administrative documents from the Akkadian Empire of Sargon and his successors, who conquered the Sumerian city-states and created the first major territorial empire in Mesopotamian history during the 24th and 23rd centuries before the Common Era. These references indicate that Babylon existed as a minor provincial centre, important enough to warrant administrative attention, but lacking the prestige and influence of the ancient Sumerian religious capitals. The deity who served as patron of this modest settlement was Marduk, whose name has been interpreted by scholars in various ways, though the most widely accepted etymology derives from the Sumerian phrase meaning young bull of the sun god. This linguistic origin suggests that Marduk may have originally been conceived as a solar deity, or as a youthful manifestation of divine power associated with the sun, though his later theological development would emphasize other characteristics including wisdom, magic, and martial prowess. The earliest attestations of Marduk's worship indicate that he was regarded primarily as a local deity, whose authority extended no further than the immediate vicinity of Babylon, lacking the cosmic portfolio and widespread veneration enjoyed by the great gods of the Sumerian tradition. The theological relationship between Marduk and the senior god Ea, who in Sumerian tradition was known as Enki, would prove essential for the younger deity's later elevation. Mesopotamian religious texts consistently identified Marduk as the son of Ea and his consort Damkina, placing him within the divine family structure that organized the pantheon according to generational relationships. This filial connection provided Marduk with a prestigious divine lineage, while also establishing a mechanism through which he could inherit and expand upon the characteristics associated with his father, particularly Ea's mastery of wisdom, magic, and the creative arts. The theological implications of this relationship would be developed extensively in later Babylonian religious literature, which portrayed Marduk as the worthy heir who ultimately surpassed his father through his cosmic achievements. The political circumstances that created the conditions for Marduk's theological elevation began during the period of instability that followed the collapse of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, the last great Sumerian empire that had unified southern Mesopotamia under the rule of the kings of Ur from approximately 2112 to 2004 before the Common Era. The Ur III period represented the final flowering of Sumerian political and cultural dominance, a century of centralized administration and cultural achievement that established administrative practices and literary traditions that would influence subsequent Mesopotamian civilization. The collapse of this empire, brought about by a combination of internal pressures and external invasions by Amorite peoples from the western deserts and Elamites from the highlands to the east, created a fragmented political landscape in which numerous small kingdoms competed for territory and influence. Among the Amorite leaders who established themselves in Mesopotamia during this period of fragmentation was a dynasty that made Babylon their capital, and from this base gradually extended their control over surrounding territories. The early kings of this first dynasty of Babylon, including Sumuzabum, Sumula-el, and their successors, pursued policies of territorial consolidation and administrative development that transformed Babylon from a minor provincial town into a significant regional power. Their devotion to the local patron deity Marduk was reflected in temple-building programs and royal inscriptions that emphasized the special relationship between the Babylonian kings and their divine protector, laying the theological groundwork for the god's later cosmic promotion. The process of theological elevation accelerated dramatically during the reign of Hammurabi, the 6th king of the first dynasty of Babylon, who ruled from approximately 1792 to 1750, before the Common Era, and transformed his kingdom into the dominant power in southern Mesopotamia. Hammurabi's military campaigns conquered the major cities of the region, including the ancient religious capitals of Nippur and Eridu, whose patron deities Enlil and Ea had traditionally occupied superior positions in the divine hierarchy. The political unification of Mesopotamia under Babylonian rule created both the opportunity and the necessity for a corresponding transformation in religious ideology, one that would justify Babylon's supremacy in cosmic as well as political terms. The theological problem that faced Babylonian priests and scribes was substantial, requiring them to explain how the previously obscure patron god of Babylon could legitimately claim authority over the entire pantheon, including deities whose worship was far more ancient and whose cosmic portfolios had been established for centuries. The solution they developed combined traditional Mesopotamian religious concepts with innovative theological arguments that portrayed Marduk's rise to supremacy as the result of a cosmic crisis in which only he possessed the power and wisdom necessary to save the gods from destruction. This narrative framework, most fully developed in the Enuma Elish, but reflected in numerous other Babylonian religious texts, presented Marduk's elevation not as a usurpation of divine authority, but as a rightful assumption of power earned through his unique qualifications and demonstrated by his cosmic achievements. The theological strategy employed by Babylonian religious thinkers involved the identification of Marduk with the characteristics and powers traditionally associated with other major deities, a process of divine synthesis that concentrated within a single figure the attributes dispersed among the various gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon. This identification was accomplished through various mechanisms including the assignment of divine names, the transfer of mythological narratives, and the reinterpretation of cultic practices, all of which served to expand Marduk's cosmic portfolio, while maintaining formal acknowledgement of the other gods' continued existence. The result was a theological system that approached but did not quite achieve monotheism, preserving the polytheistic framework of Mesopotamian religion, while subordinating all other deities to Marduk's supreme authority. The physical setting in which Marduk received worship reflected and reinforced his elevated theological status, particularly as Babylon itself grew into one of the major cities of the ancient world. The temple complex known as the Asagala occupied the religious heart of Babylon, a massive establishment that housed not only the primary cult statue of Marduk, but also chapels dedicated to numerous other deities whose worship was incorporated into the Marduk cult. The architectural grandeur of the Asagala proclaimed the god's cosmic importance through its scale and ornamentation, with precious materials adorning the cult statue and temple furnishings, while elaborate rituals performed by specialized priesthoods maintained the daily cycle of divine service. The ziggurat Etemenanki, whose construction and reconstruction occupied Babylonian kings across centuries, rose adjacent to the Asagala as a physical embodiment of the connection between heaven and earth that Marduk's cosmic role established. These stepped temple towers, characteristic of Mesopotamian religious architecture, were understood as stairways connecting the earthly and celestial realms, providing both a dwelling place for the gods when they descended to earth, and a point of contact through which human prayers and offerings could ascend to the divine sphere. The Etemenanki achieved particular fame in antiquity as one of the largest and most impressive ziggurats ever constructed, inspiring wonder among visitors and later forming the basis for the biblical tradition of the Tower of Babel. The religious life centered on Marduk's worship achieved its most elaborate expression during the Akitu festival, the Babylonian New Year celebration that took place over 12 days in the month of Nisanu, corresponding roughly to late March and early April in the modern calendar. This festival combined cosmic renewal rituals with political legitimation ceremonies, enacting through symbolic performance the mythological narratives that explained Marduk's supremacy and tied his divine authority to the earthly rule of Babylonian kings. The ceremonial program included the public reading of the Enuma Elish, the humiliation and reinvestiture of the king before Marduk's cult statue, processions through the sacred streets of Babylon, and elaborate rituals performed in the Bitakitu or festival house outside the main city. The theological significance of the Akitu festival extended beyond mere commemoration of mythological events to encompass the actual renewal of cosmic order through ritual performance. Mesopotamian religious thought conceived of the world as requiring constant divine maintenance to prevent the forces of chaos from reasserting themselves, and the annual Akitu rituals provided the mechanism through which this cosmic renewal was accomplished. The participation of the king in these ceremonies demonstrated his role as Marduk's earthly representative. the human agent through whom divine order was maintained in the political sphere just as the god himself maintained order in the cosmic realm. The Enuma Elish, the epic narrative that most fully developed the mythology of Marduk's rise to supremacy, represents one of the most significant religious texts to survive from the ancient Near East, providing not only an account of cosmic creation, but also a theological justification for the political and religious preeminence of Babylon and its patron deity. The composition's title, derived from its opening words meaning "when on high," reflects the Mesopotamian practice of naming texts by their initial phrase, while also indicating the cosmic scope of the narrative that follows. Though the text as we possess it probably dates from the reign of Nebuchadnezzar the Hun in the 12th century before the Common Era, scholars generally agree that it incorporates older traditions and reflects theological developments, extending back to the time of Hammurabi. The Enuma Elish opens with a description of the primordial state before creation, when nothing existed except the mingled waters of Apsu, the freshwater underground ocean, and Tiamat, the saltwater sea. These primordial beings represented the undifferentiated chaos that preceded the ordered cosmos, their union producing successive generations of gods, whose activity and noise eventually disturbed the tranquility of the original state. The conflict between the elder chaos powers and the younger gods provides the dramatic framework for the epic, culminating in the cosmic battle between Marduk and Tiamat that would determine the fate of existence itself. The characterization of Tiamat in the Enuma Elish reflects ancient Mesopotamian conceptions of cosmic chaos and the primordial sea. Her name derives from the Akkadian word for ocean, and she embodies the threatening aspects of the salt sea that surrounded the Mesopotamian conception of the earth, a vast and potentially hostile force that required divine control to prevent it from overwhelming the ordered world. The text describes her as a monstrous figure who creates an army of fearsome creatures to fight against the younger gods, investing her champion Chingu with the tablet of destinies that conferred supreme authority over cosmic fate. The imagery associated with Tiamat draws upon Mesopotamian traditions of dragon slaying and combat myths, while also reflecting anxieties about the forces of nature that threatened agricultural civilization in the riverine environment of southern Mesopotamia. The crisis created by Tiamat's hostility threatens the very existence of the divine order, as the older gods prove incapable of confronting her power. Ea, whose wisdom had previously solved divine problems, attempts to combat Tiamat but fails, as does Nu the sky god despite his senior position in the pantheon. The inability of the traditional supreme deities to meet this cosmic challenge creates the narrative opportunity for Marduk's emergence as the champion of the gods, the hero whose unique combination of qualities enables him to accomplish what the older gods could not achieve. Marduk's qualifications for this cosmic role are established through elaborate descriptions of his birth and early characteristics. The Enuma Elish portrays him as possessing exceptional divine qualities from the moment of his creation, surpassing other gods in wisdom, power, and the various attributes necessary for cosmic leadership. His father Ea recognizes his son's extraordinary nature and presents him to the divine assembly as the potential savior of the gods, while Marduk himself demonstrates confidence in his ability to defeat Tiamat and restore cosmic order. The text emphasizes that Marduk's superiority is inherent rather than acquired, manifested in his very being rather than developed through experience, though his cosmic achievement in defeating Tiamat will provide the demonstration that justifies his claim to supremacy. The negotiation between Marduk and the assembled gods establishes the conditions under which he will undertake the dangerous combat with Tiamat. Marduk demands that if he successfully defeats the Chaos Dragon and saves the gods from destruction, they must acknowledge his supreme authority over the entire pantheon, granting him powers and prerogatives that had previously been reserved for the senior deities Anu and Enlil. The god's acceptance of these conditions, formalized through the granting of the power to determine fates through his word alone, represents a constitutional transformation of the divine order that elevates Marduk above all other deities while preserving the formal existence of the pantheon. This divine assembly scene provides the theological legitimation for Marduk's supremacy by showing that his elevation resulted from free agreement among the gods rather than from forcible usurpation. The combat between Marduk and Tiamat occupies a central position in the Enuma Elish and represents one of the most developed battle narratives in ancient Mesopotamian literature. The text describes Marduk arming himself with his divine weapons, including the 4 winds, the 7 winds of destruction, the flood weapon, and other elemental forces before advancing to confront Tiamat and her monstrous army. The battle itself combines elements of single combat between champions with cosmic imagery, suggesting the forces of order contending against primordial chaos, presenting Marduk's victory as both a military triumph and a cosmic transformation. The method of Tiamat's defeat demonstrates Marduk's superior cunning, as well as his martial prowess. When Tiamat opens her mouth to consume him, Marduk sends the winds into her body to distend and immobilize her, then shoots an arrow through her heart to destroy her. This victory over the Chaos Dragon establishes Marduk as the champion who has saved the gods and earned the right to shape the cosmos according to his design, a role he immediately assumes by dismembering Tiamat's corpse and using its parts as the raw material for creation. The creative acts that follow Marduk's victory transform the primordial chaos into the ordered cosmos, establishing the structures of heaven and earth that provide the framework for all subsequent existence. From Tiamat's body, Marduk fashions the sky above and the earth below. From her eyes flow the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, from her udder rise the mountains, and from various other parts come the other features of the physical world. This cosmogonic narrative presents creation as the result of divine victory over chaos, emphasizing that the ordered world exists only through Marduk's power and depends upon his continued maintenance for its preservation. The establishment of cosmic order extends beyond physical creation to encompass the organization of divine society and the regulation of cosmic time. Marduk assigns stations and responsibilities to the various gods, determining their places within the celestial hierarchy and allocating their cosmic functions. He creates the heavenly bodies to mark the passage of time and regulate the calendar, establishing the framework through which human beings will organize their agricultural and religious activities. The orderly cosmos that results from Marduk's creative work reflects his wisdom and power, while also demonstrating his fitness for supreme divine authority. The creation of humanity completes Marduk's cosmic achievement and establishes the purpose for which human beings exist within the Babylonian theological system. Humanity is created from the blood of Chingu, Tiamat's defeated champion, mixed with clay to form the physical substance of human bodies. The purpose of this creation is explicitly stated as the provision of service to the gods, freeing the divine beings from the labour previously required to maintain themselves. This anthropology, which defines human existence in terms of service to the gods, reflects broader Mesopotamian concepts of the relationship between divine and human realms, while also justifying the elaborate temple establishments and priestly rituals through which this service was performed. The gratitude of the gods for their deliverance finds expression in the construction of Babylon and the Asagala, which the Enuma Elish presents as a divine project undertaken by the assembled deities to honour their saviour. The gods themselves labour to build Marduk's temple, modelling their work on the celestial structures he has created and establishing Babylon as the earthly counterpart to the heavenly dwelling of the supreme god. This narrative explains the cosmic significance of Babylon, while justifying the city's claim to religious preeminence throughout Mesopotamia, presenting its temples not as human constructions, but as divine establishments whose sanctity derived from their creation by the gods themselves. The culmination of the Enuma Elish comes in the recitation of Marduk's 50 divine names, a lengthy section that occupies the final portion of the epic and represents the theological heart of the composition. These names are not merely titles or epithets, but rather divine powers and attributes that concentrate within Marduk the characteristics and functions traditionally distributed among the various gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon. Through the enumeration of these names, the text accomplishes the theological synthesis that identifies Marduk with the powers of all other deities, while preserving their formal existence within a subordinate pantheon. The 50 names include traditional divine titles and newly created epithets, each accompanied by explanations that identify the powers and responsibilities associated with each name. Marduk receives names identifying him with the creative power of Ea, the executive authority of Enlil, the supreme dignity of Anu, and the functions of numerous other deities whose attributes are absorbed into his comprehensive divine personality. The theological significance of this accumulation extends beyond mere honorific inflation to accomplish a fundamental reconception of divine power, concentrating what had been dispersed among many gods within a single supreme deity, whose authority encompasses all aspects of cosmic governance. The theological mechanics underlying the 50 names reveal sophisticated conceptual frameworks that distinguish Babylonian religious thought from simpler forms of polytheistic organization. Each name functions not as a mere honorific appellation, but as a distinct center of divine power, a concentrated node of cosmic authority that Marduk absorbs into his comprehensive being while simultaneously projecting outward into the governance of specific cosmic domains. The Babylonian priests who composed and transmitted the Enuma Elish understood these names as operative theological principles, verbal formulations that accomplished real transformations in the structure of divine power through their ritual pronunciation and liturgical deployment. The annual recitation of the entire epic during the Akitu festival renewed and reinforced these identifications, ensuring that Marduk's supremacy remained active and effective throughout the cosmic and political domains that depended upon his continued authority. The process by which Marduk acquires these names within the narrative structure of the Enuma Elish follows careful ceremonial protocols that reflect Babylonian understandings of legitimate authority transfer. The assembled gods do not simply proclaim Marduk's titles, but rather bestow them through formal declarations that acknowledge his achievements and recognize the powers he has demonstrated through his victory over Tiamat. Anu, the ancient sky god whose primordial authority had preceded all other divine powers, grants Marduk names that transfer the executive functions of cosmic kingship from the older generation of gods to the victorious champion. Enlil, whose position as king of the gods Marduk effectively supersedes, contributes names that identify the younger god with the powers of terrestrial authority and the governance of human affairs. Ea, Marduk's own father and the god of wisdom whose intellectual powers had proven insufficient against Tiamat's challenge, bestows names that complete the transfer of cosmic intelligence and creative capability to his more powerful son. The selection and arrangement of the 50 names follows patterns that reveal the systematic theological thinking underlying the composition. The names proceed from more abstract cosmic principles toward more specific functional responsibilities, establishing first Marduk's identity with the fundamental forces of existence, before detailing his governance of particular cosmic domains. The early names emphasize creative power and cosmic authority, identifying Marduk with the generative forces that brought the universe into being, and the executive principles that maintain its continued operation. Subsequent names address more specific functions, from the regulation of celestial movements to the provision of agricultural fertility, from the governance of human societies to the maintenance of cosmic justice. The cumulative effect creates a portrait of comprehensive divine power that leaves no aspect of existence outside Marduk's direct authority and active governance. The linguistic dimensions of the 50 names demonstrate the close relationship between Babylonian theology and the scholarly traditions of scribal learning that preserved and transmitted religious knowledge. Many of the names involve elaborate etymological explanations that derive their meanings from Sumerian and Akkadian word roots, reflecting the bilingual character of Mesopotamian learned culture and the prestige attached to Sumerian as the sacred language of ancient religious tradition. The priests who composed these explanations drew upon centuries of scribal learning, incorporating grammatical analysis and lexical scholarship into their theological constructions. This scholarly dimension distinguishes Babylonian religious thought from more popular forms of religious expression, marking the 50-name section of the Enuma Elish as the product of learned priestly circles whose theological sophistication matched their philological expertise. The relationship between the 50 names and the broader Mesopotamian divine pantheon reveals the careful balancing act required by Babylonian theological imperialism. The text does not abolish the other gods or deny their continued existence, but rather incorporates their powers within Marduk's comprehensive authority, while preserving their subordinate reality within the cosmic hierarchy. This theological strategy accomplishes several purposes simultaneously, satisfying Babylonian claims to religious supremacy, while avoiding the offence that outright rejection of traditional deities might cause among populations whose local religious traditions remained attached to other divine figures. The gods whose powers Marduk absorbs continue to exist as real divine beings, but their authority derives from and remains subordinate to the supreme god whose comprehensive power encompasses their more limited functions. The theological framework established through the 50 names anticipates patterns that would later characterize monotheistic religious thought, though significant differences distinguish the Babylonian system from the exclusive monotheisms that would emerge in subsequent centuries. Marduk's supremacy does not eliminate other gods, but rather organises them within a hierarchical structure headed by a single dominant figure whose authority extends throughout all cosmic domains. This pattern, sometimes described as henotheism or monarchical polytheism, represents a distinctive theological position that combines elements of both polytheistic diversity and monotheistic unity. The conceptual tools developed by Babylonian theologians to articulate Marduk's relationship to other gods would influence subsequent religious thinkers struggling to express similar ideas about divine unity and cosmic governance, though the specific paths of transmission remain subjects of scholarly investigation and debate. The ritual context within which the 50 names received their most significant expression was the Akitu festival, the great New Year celebration that constituted the most important religious observance in the Babylonian liturgical calendar. This festival, celebrated over 12 days in the spring month of Nisanu, involved elaborate ceremonial activities that renewed cosmic order, reaffirmed royal authority, and ensured divine blessing for the coming year. The complete recitation of the Enuma Elish formed a central element of the festival program, performed by priests before the assembled divine images and the participating human community. Through this annual repetition, the mythological narrative maintained its active power within Babylonian religious consciousness, functioning not as ancient story, but as present ritual action that renewed and reinforced the cosmic order established through Marduk's primordial victory. The festival activities extended beyond textual recitation to encompass dramatic performances that embodied the mythological narrative through ritual action. The king played a central role in these ceremonies, his participation establishing the connection between divine authority and human governance that legitimized Babylonian political structures. During one portion of the festival, the king underwent ritual humiliation before the statue of Marduk, having his royal insignia removed and receiving blows from the high priest before his restoration to royal dignity. This ceremony expressed the dependence of human kingship upon divine favour, while also renewing the covenant between God and king that authorised royal rule. The king's identification with Marduk through various festival activities reinforced the theological connections between cosmic and political order that justified Babylonian imperial claims. The processional elements of the Akitu festival brought the divine presence into direct contact with the urban landscape of Babylon, transforming the city into sacred space through the movement of divine images along the ceremonial way. Marduk's statue travelled from the Asagala temple to the Akitu temple outside the city walls, a journey that reenacted mythological narratives while also demonstrating the god's power over the territories through which the procession passed. The elaborate architecture constructed along the processional route, including the famous Ishtar Gate with its glazed brick decorations depicting lions, dragons, and bulls, created a ceremonial environment worthy of the divine presence it accommodated. These permanent architectural investments transformed Babylon into a city designed around the requirements of divine worship, its physical structure expressing the theological principles that governed its religious life. The relationship between Marduk and the Babylonian king found expression in theological formulations that presented royal authority as divinely delegated and cosmically sanctioned. The king received his power directly from Marduk, whose choice and blessing legitimized royal rule while also imposing obligations of justice and proper governance. Royal inscriptions regularly emphasized this divine relationship, presenting military victories as demonstrations of Marduk's favour, and territorial expansions as extensions of his cosmic authority. The king functioned as Marduk's earthly representative, his administration of human affairs mirroring the god's governance of cosmic domains. This theological framework provided both legitimacy and constraint, authorizing royal power while also defining its responsibilities and limits through reference to divine standards of justice and righteousness. The extension of Marduk's authority to encompass previously independent divine functions reflected the broader patterns of political and cultural centralization that characterized the Babylonian period in Mesopotamian history. Just as the Babylonian state absorbed formerly independent city-states into its administrative structure, so Babylonian theology absorbed formerly independent divine figures into a hierarchical system dominated by the national god. The theological imperialism evident in the Enuma Elish paralleled the political imperialism that extended Babylonian authority throughout Mesopotamia, each reinforcing and legitimizing the other through mutual reference and shared conceptual frameworks. The success of Babylonian political expansion provided evidence for Marduk's cosmic power, while the theological claims of the Enuma Elish justified Babylonian political ambitions as expressions of divine will and cosmic necessity. The preservation and transmission of the Enuma Elish depended upon the institutional structures of Babylonian temple learning, where scribal schools maintain the textual traditions essential to religious practice and theological reflection. Young scribes learned to copy and recite the epic as part of their professional training, ensuring the continued availability of authoritative texts for ritual use, while also transmitting the theological knowledge embedded within the narrative. The multiple copies of the epic recovered from various archaeological sites throughout Mesopotamia testify to its widespread distribution and continuing significance throughout the centuries of Babylonian religious history. These copies preserve variant readings and scribal corrections that illuminate the processes of textual transmission, while also demonstrating the care with which religious texts were preserved and corrected according to authoritative standards. The theological concepts developed within the Enuma Elish exercised influence far beyond the immediate context of Babylonian religious practice, shaping religious thought throughout the ancient Near East, and contributing to the intellectual environment within which subsequent religious traditions would develop. The combat mythology that structures the epic's narrative, presenting creation as the result of divine victory over chaotic forces, appears in modified forms throughout ancient Near Eastern religious literature, from Canaanite myths of Baal's conflict with Yam to biblical passages depicting divine combat with sea monsters and primordial chaos. While direct dependence cannot always be demonstrated, the conceptual vocabulary and narrative patterns developed within Mesopotamian religious thought provided resources that other religious traditions adapted and transformed according to their own theological requirements. The relationship between Marduk's comprehensive authority and later concepts of divine unity has attracted considerable scholarly attention, though interpretations differ regarding the nature and extent of historical connections. Some scholars emphasize the differences between Babylonian henotheism and genuine monotheism, noting that the Enuma Elish preserves rather than eliminates the existence of other gods, and maintains polytheistic worship practices despite Marduk's supremacy. Other scholars highlight the theological innovations that concentrated diverse divine powers within a single figure, arguing that these conceptual developments contributed to the intellectual environment within which monotheistic ideas would later emerge. The question of influence becomes particularly complex regarding Israelite religion, which developed within a broader cultural context, shaped by Mesopotamian patterns, while also articulating distinctive theological positions that distinguished Yahweh from the gods of surrounding peoples. The attributes assigned to Marduk through the 50 names include characteristics that would later appear prominently in monotheistic descriptions of the supreme divine being. Marduk possesses comprehensive creative power, having brought the ordered cosmos into existence through his victory over chaos and his subsequent creative activities. He exercises universal sovereignty, his authority extending throughout all cosmic domains and encompassing all aspects of existence within his governance. He maintains cosmic justice, ensuring that righteous behavior receives reward while wickedness meets appropriate punishment. He responds to human prayer, hearing the petitions of his worshippers and intervening in human affairs according to his sovereign will. He possesses complete knowledge, understanding the secrets of cosmic governance and the needs of all creatures within his creation. These attributes, concentrated within a single divine figure whose supremacy encompasses all other gods, establish patterns that would recur in subsequent religious traditions despite the significant theological differences that distinguish monotheistic systems from Babylonian henotheism. The temples dedicated to Marduk's worship represented massive investments of economic resources and organizational capacity, their construction and maintenance requiring the coordinated labor of thousands of workers and the dedication of substantial agricultural and commercial revenues. The Esagila complex at Babylon included not only the temple proper, but also extensive auxiliary structures housing priestly personnel, administrative offices, storage facilities, and workshops for the production of cultic objects and the preparation of sacrificial offerings. The associated ziggurat known as the Etemenanki, and popularly identified with the biblical Tower of Babel, rose in 7 stages to a height that dominated the Babylonian skyline. its summit providing a sacred space for ceremonies that brought divine and human realms into contact. The scale of these constructions expressed the importance attached to Marduk's worship, while also demonstrating the organizational capabilities of the Babylonian state and its capacity to mobilize resources for religious purposes. The priestly establishment serving Marduk's temple constituted a powerful institution within Babylonian society, its members exercising significant influence over religious, intellectual and economic affairs. The priests who performed daily rituals, maintained sacred traditions, and administered temple properties formed a hereditary professional class whose knowledge and skills passed from generation to generation within priestly families. Their responsibilities included not only ritual performance, but also the preservation and interpretation of religious texts, the training of new priests, the administration of temple estates, and the maintenance of astronomical observations essential to calendar regulation. The intersection of religious authority with economic power made the temple priesthood a significant political force, its support or opposition affecting the stability of royal administrations and the success of dynastic claims. The economic dimensions of Marduk's cult reflected the broader patterns of temple economy that characterized Mesopotamian civilization throughout its history. Temple estates included agricultural lands, livestock herds, workshops, and commercial enterprises whose revenues supported cultic activities, while also contributing to broader economic circulation. The movement of goods and services through temple institutions facilitated economic integration across the Babylonian realm, with religious festivals providing occasions for commercial exchange as well as ritual observance. The god himself was conceived as owning the property dedicated to his service, with human administrators functioning as stewards responsible for the proper management of divine resources. This theological framework provided both legitimacy and accountability for temple economic activities, presenting property management as religious duty while also subjecting administrators to divine standards of honest stewardship. The integration of astronomical observation with religious practice represented a distinctive feature of Babylonian temple learning, with priests developing sophisticated methods for tracking celestial movements and predicting astronomical phenomena. These observations served both practical and theological purposes, providing data necessary for calendar regulation, while also generating information used for omen interpretation and religious prognostication. The connection between celestial bodies and divine powers, established through Marduk's assignment of cosmic stations in the Enuma Elish, gave astronomical observation religious significance that justified the substantial resources invested in observational programs. The resulting astronomical records, preserved on clay tablets recovered from temple archives, constitute some of the earliest systematic scientific data in human history, their precision and comprehensiveness reflecting the institutional commitment to accurate observation that characterized Babylonian temple learning. The calendar system regulated by these astronomical observations structured both agricultural activities and religious observances, its proper maintenance essential for the coordination of human affairs with cosmic rhythms. Marduk's role as establisher of celestial order made calendar regulation a religious responsibility, its proper performance honouring the god who had created the system of temporal measurement. The lunar months that formed the basic units of the Babylonian calendar required periodic adjustment to maintain alignment with the solar year and its agricultural seasons, a process that depended upon accurate astronomical observation and priestly calculations. The intercalation of additional months when necessary demonstrated the ongoing requirement for human participation in the maintenance of cosmic order, with priestly expertise serving as the means through which Marduk's calendrical system continued to function effectively. The festivals that punctuated the Babylonian calendar provided occasions for the collective expression of religious devotion, while also reinforcing the social and political structures that organized Babylonian society around the worship of its supreme deity. The most important of these celebrations, the New Year festival known as the Akitu, occupied 11 days at the beginning of spring and involved elaborate ceremonies that enacted fundamental theological themes, while also addressing practical concerns about agricultural fertility, political legitimacy, and cosmic renewal. The participation of the king in these rituals demonstrated the essential connection between royal authority and divine sanction, with the monarch's performance of prescribed actions during the festival serving to renew his commission as Marduk's earthly representative The complexity of the Akitu ceremonies reflected the sophisticated theological thinking that had developed around Marduk's worship, their sequence of events creating a ritual drama that brought participants into direct engagement with the mythological narratives explaining Marduk's supremacy and Babylon's special status among the cities of Mesopotamia. The recitation of the Enuma Elish during the Akitu festival constituted one of the most significant religious performances in Babylonian culture, the annual repetition of this creation narrative serving both commemorative and cosmological functions that extended far beyond simple entertainment or education. The priests who chanted these verses before assembled worshippers were understood to be participating in an act of cosmic maintenance, their vocal performance contributing to the ongoing stability of the universal order that Marduk had established through his primordial victory over the forces of chaos. The power of spoken words in Mesopotamian religious thinking gave ritual recitation genuine efficacy, transforming the narration of past events into present-tense participation in the cosmic dynamics those events had inaugurated. This understanding of narrative performance as cosmologically significant explains the care with which priestly traditions preserved the exact wording of sacred texts, variations in recitation potentially affecting the efficacy of ritual action and the stability of the cosmic order that ritual was intended to support. The theological content of the Enuma Elish provided the foundational mythology that justified Marduk's position at the head of the divine pantheon, while also explaining the origins of the universe and humanity's place within the cosmic order. The narrative begins not with Marduk, but with the primordial situation that preceded all divine generations, describing a state in which only Apsu, the sweet water, and Tiamat, the salt water, existed in undifferentiated union. Their mingling produced the first generations of gods, whose activities disturbed the primordial peace and provoked conflict between the elder powers and their divine offspring. The progression from cosmic origins through divine genealogy to the crisis that would necessitate a champion established the narrative framework within which Marduk's emergence as supreme deity would occur. His eventual triumph presented not as arbitrary elevation, but as earned supremacy, arising from demonstrated capability in the face of existential threat. The characterization of Tiamat in the Enuma Elish reflects complex theological dynamics that transcended simple good versus evil opposition, her portrayal combining elements of primordial motherhood with the terrifying power of chaos threatening to unmake the created order. The goddess who had participated in the generation of divine life transforms into a monster intent upon the destruction of her own offspring, her anger at the killing of Apsu by the younger gods motivating her creation of an army of frightening creatures designed to annihilate the divine assembly. The 11 monsters she produces for this purpose, including serpent dragons, lions, scorpion men, and other terrifying combinations of animal and supernatural features, represent the forces of disorder that constantly threaten the maintenance of cosmic stability. The transformation of the mother goddess into the mother of monsters expressed theological anxieties about the relationship between creative and destructive powers, the same fertile capacity that had produced divine generations now directed toward their undoing. The crisis facing the divine assembly as Tiamat marshalled her forces provided the dramatic context for Marduk's emergence as the solution to an apparently insurmountable problem. The senior gods who attempted to confront Tiamat before Marduk's intervention proved incapable of facing her terrible power, their failure establishing the magnitude of the threat while also demonstrating the inadequacy of existing divine leadership to address the existential danger. Ea, the god of wisdom and Marduk's father, whose earlier killing of Apsu had precipitated the current crisis, found himself unable to repeat his previous success against the far more formidable Tiamat. Anu, the sky god who stood at the head of the traditional divine hierarchy, similarly retreated before the chaos goddess's overwhelming presence, his failure representing the inadequacy of the established order to defend itself against the forces threatening its destruction. The assembly's recognition that only Marduk possessed the capabilities necessary to defeat Tiamat marked the beginning of the young god's transformation from rising deity to acknowledged king of the gods. The narrative presents this recognition as arising from Marduk's demonstrated powers, particularly his ability to destroy and recreate a constellation through verbal command alone, a test proposed by the assembled gods to verify his suitability for the role of divine champion. This demonstration of creative and destructive power through spoken word established Marduk's capacity for the cosmic scale action that would be required to defeat Tiamat and reorganize the universe following her destruction. The gods' response to this demonstration included their formal grant of supreme authority to Marduk, their collective decision investing him with powers and prerogatives that elevated his status far above his position as son of Ea and grandson of Anu in the divine genealogy. The conditions Marduk established before accepting the role of divine champion revealed both his strategic acumen and the narrative's concern with establishing legitimate foundations for his permanent supremacy. His demand that the gods grant him irrevocable kingship over their assembly, his word becoming determinative of divine decisions and his decrees beyond appeal or reversal, transformed a temporary military commission into permanent constitutional change in divine governance. The assembled gods' acceptance of these conditions, formalized through their collective proclamation of Marduk's supremacy and their bestowal of the 50 names that concentrated divine powers in his person, created the theological basis for understanding Marduk not merely as a powerful deity among many, but as the supreme being whose authority encompassed and transcended all other divine powers. The combat between Marduk and Tiamat, as described in the Enuma Elish, provided the mythological foundation for understanding the god's role as defender of cosmic order against the forces of chaos. The narrative describes Marduk preparing for battle with weapons and powers appropriate to his status as champion of the divine assembly, his armament including a bow and arrows, a mace, lightning, a net held by the 4 winds, and 7 terrible storms that he created for the specific purpose of overwhelming his monstrous opponent. The visual imagery of this divine warrior setting forth against the primordial chaos goddess, surrounded by winds and storms while bearing weapons of cosmic power, established iconographic traditions that would influence artistic representations of Marduk throughout the subsequent history of his worship. The psychological dimension of the combat receives attention in the narrative, with Marduk's verbal challenge to Tiamat and his apparent fearlessness in the face of her rage contributing to his characterization as a deity whose courage matched his power. The actual killing of Tiamat occurred through a combination of cosmic forces and physical violence that demonstrated both Marduk's control over the fundamental elements and his capacity for decisive action in the face of ultimate danger. The narrative describes Marduk driving an evil wind into Tiamat's gaping mouth as she attempted to swallow him, the inflation of her belly preventing her from closing her jaws, while also immobilizing her for the killing stroke. His arrow, shot through her open mouth, penetrated her heart and ended her existence. The dramatic finality of this moment establishing the completeness of Marduk's victory over the primordial chaos that had threatened universal destruction. The defeat and humiliation of Tiamat's general Kingi, from whom Marduk seized the tablet of destinies that conferred supreme authority over cosmic fate, completed the military phase of his triumph, while also securing the instrument of legitimate rule that would characterize his ongoing sovereignty. The cosmogonic activities that followed Marduk's victory over Tiamat transformed the narrative from combat mythology to creation account, the defeated chaos goddess becoming the raw material from which the god would fashion the organized universe. The famous description of Marduk splitting Tiamat's body like a dried fish, using half to form the heavenly firmament and half to establish the foundations of earth, presented cosmic structure as arising from the creative transformation of chaotic potential into ordered actuality. This model of creation through the reorganization of pre-existing material, rather than creation from nothing distinguished Mesopotamian cosmogony from later traditions that would emphasize divine creation ex nihilo, though the comprehensive nature of Marduk's creative work still positioned him as the author of all cosmic structures and their sustaining order. The establishment of celestial stations, the assignment of stars and constellations to their proper positions, and the regulation of heavenly movements constituted essential aspects of Marduk's cosmogonic activity that connected his primordial creative work to the ongoing astronomical observations performed by his priests in Babylon. The moon god Sin received his assignment to regulate the month through his phases, while the sun god Shamash received his commission to traverse the heavens and illuminate the earth, their subordination to Marduk's organizing authority, establishing the hierarchical relationships that characterized the divine realm following his assumption of supreme power. The practical utility of these celestial bodies for human timekeeping and agricultural planning connected Marduk's primordial arrangements to the daily concerns of his worshippers, their experience of seasonal rhythms and lunar cycles serving as constant reminders of the cosmic order he had established and continued to maintain. The creation of humanity in the Enuma Elish served the particular purpose of relieving the gods of the burdensome labour necessary for their own maintenance, the narrative presenting human existence as fundamentally oriented toward divine service. The blood of the defeated king, Tiamat's general and the traitor who had borne the tablet of destinies against the divine assembly, provided the material from which Ea fashioned humankind at Marduk's command, this origin explaining both human mortality and the element of rebelliousness that characterized human nature, while also establishing humanity's essential purpose as servants of the gods. The liberation of the gods from physical labour through the creation of human substitutes transformed the divine condition, allowing the gods to devote themselves to the concerns appropriate to their elevated status, while humans performed the agricultural work, temple construction, and cultic service that sustained divine worship. This theological anthropology, while perhaps appearing harsh to modern sensibilities, provided a coherent explanation for human existence that integrated physical labour, religious devotion, and cosmic purpose into a unified understanding of humanity's place within the universal order. The establishment of Babylon as Marduk's dwelling place, and the centre of cosmic significance, represented the culmination of the Enuma Elish's narrative, transforming the Babylonian city's political prominence into reflection of its privileged position within divine arrangements. The god's construction of the Asagala temple and the Etemenanki ziggurat as gifts to Marduk following his creative work expressed their gratitude while also establishing the architectural forms that would characterize Babylonian sacred space throughout subsequent centuries. The narrative's presentation of Babylon, as literally built by the gods as a dwelling for their king, invested the physical city with cosmic significance that transcended its mundane functions as administrative centre and commercial hub, its structures becoming meeting points between earthly and divine realms, whose proper maintenance constituted religious obligation of the highest order. The 50 names bestowed upon Marduk by the assembled gods constitute one of the most theologically significant portions of the Enuma Elish, their enumeration and explanation occupying substantial space within the composition, while also revealing the comprehensive scope of divine powers concentrated in Marduk's person. These names function not as mere titles or epithets, but as actual concentrations of divine capability, each name representing specific powers and responsibilities that Marduk exercises within his role as supreme deity. The presentation of these names draws upon the traditions of multiple deities whose individual powers become absorbed into Marduk's comprehensive authority, his 50 names effectively summarizing the entire pantheon's capabilities within a single divine person. This theological move toward concentrating divine power in a supreme being while maintaining the formal existence of other deities represents a distinctive stage in religious development that would find parallels in other ancient traditions moving toward more unified conceptions of divine reality. The first of the 50 names, Marduk itself, receives explanation in terms of the god's parentage and his role as supreme among the gods, the name functioning as the foundation upon which the subsequent 49 names build. The names that follow include Maruka, which emphasizes his role as god of all the gods, Marutuku, which connects him to refuge and protection for his land, and Barashakushu, which presents him as dwelling in the heart of Tiamat and taking up residence at the center of the defeated chaos. The progression through the list reveals the encyclopedic scope of powers attributed to Marduk, from cosmic creation and governance to practical concerns about agriculture, justice, healing, and protection. Each name receives etymological or functional explanation that connects its meaning to specific aspects of Marduk's activity and authority, the cumulative effect establishing him as deity, whose capabilities encompassed every dimension of divine action, relevant to human welfare and cosmic maintenance. The final 10 names among the 50 hold particular significance, representing the names bestowed by Ea himself, and thus carrying the authority of the wisdom god whose creative intelligence had established many of the fundamental structures of Mesopotamian religious thought. These names, including Ea's own name transferred to Marduk, expressed the concentration of wisdom tradition within Marduk's comprehensive authority, His assumption of Ea's designation representing the most dramatic instance of power transfer implied by the 50-name theology. The explanation accompanying Ea's bestowal of his own name suggests that father and son have become functionally identical, Marduk's exercise of wisdom and creative power indistinguishable from Ea's despite their continued formal existence as separate divine persons. This theological move toward functional monotheism within a formally polytheistic framework represents one of the most sophisticated aspects of Babylonian religious thinking, its implications extending far beyond the specific cultic context within which it developed. The relationship between Marduk's 50 names and the broader Mesopotamian pantheon reveals the synthetic character of his supremacy, his comprehensive authority built through the absorption of powers traditionally associated with multiple distinct deities. The storm god traditions that emphasize divine power over weather and atmospheric phenomena became incorporated into Marduk's identity through names connecting him to wind, rain, and the forces of storm. The solar imagery that characterized Shamash, the sun god, found reflection in names presenting Marduk as illuminator and source of cosmic light. The wisdom traditions associated with Ea contributed names emphasizing Marduk's intelligence, craftiness, and creative capability. The martial qualities associated with various warrior gods informed names presenting Marduk as champion, defender, and conqueror of divine enemies. This synthetic approach to divine characterization allowed Marduk's worship to incorporate devotional traditions from multiple sources while subordinating their specific focuses to his comprehensive sovereignty. The strange parallels between Marduk's theological position and the characteristics of later monotheistic supreme beings have attracted scholarly attention since the earliest academic study of Mesopotamian religion, their significance extending beyond mere curiosity to illuminate fundamental patterns in human religious development. The concentration of divine powers in a single supreme deity, the subordination of other divine beings to this central figure's authority, the attribution of cosmic creation and universal governance to one god whose capabilities encompass all aspects of divine action, and the presentation of proper relationship with this supreme being as the essential requirement for human flourishing, all find expression in Marduk's theological profile as developed through the Enuma Elish and related textual traditions. These structural similarities suggest either direct historical influence from Mesopotamian religion upon later traditions or the operation of common patterns in religious development that produce similar theological solutions to similar religious problems across different cultural contexts. The specific parallels between Marduk and the God of Israel have received particular attention, their examination complicated by both the undeniable historical contact between Israelite and Mesopotamian cultures and the significant theological differences that distinguish these traditions despite their structural similarities. The Israelite experience of Babylonian exile during the 6th century BCE brought Judean religious leaders into direct contact with Babylonian religious culture at precisely the period when these leaders were formulating the theological positions that would characterize mature Israelite monotheism. The question of whether Israelite theologians borrowed concepts or vocabulary from Babylonian sources, deliberately rejected and inverted Babylonian theological claims, or developed their own positions independently while sharing common ancient Near Eastern cultural heritage, remains subject to scholarly debate, whose resolution depends upon disputed interpretations of limited textual evidence. The combat mythology that features prominently in Marduk's characterization finds echoes in biblical passages that describe Israel's God doing battle with sea monsters and primordial chaos figures, imagery whose interpretation has occupied scholars concerned with tracing connections between Israelite and Mesopotamian religious traditions. References to Leviathan, Rahab, and the sea as divine enemies overcome by Yahweh suggest familiarity with combat mythology traditions that, while not necessarily derived directly from Babylonian sources, share structural features with the Marduk-Tiamat conflict that formed the centerpiece of Babylonian cosmogonic narrative. The question of whether these biblical passages represent borrowings from Babylonian tradition, independent Israelite developments of common Canaanite heritage, or deliberate polemical inversions of Babylonian claims admits no easy answer, though the recognition of parallel structures contributes to understanding the broader ancient Near Eastern context within which Israelite religious thinking developed. The theological sophistication evident in these textual parallels extends beyond mere structural similarity to encompass fundamental questions about divine nature, cosmic order, and the relationship between supreme deity and created world that characterize both Mesopotamian and later monotheistic traditions. The attribution of wisdom, power, and creative capacity to Marduk through his 50 names established a template for comprehensive divine characterization that would find echoes in the divine attribute lists developed within later religious traditions, whether through direct historical transmission, independent parallel development, or the complex interplay of influence and innovation that characterizes religious evolution across connected cultural zones. The Babylonian insistence upon Marduk's unique position as the god who alone possessed the authority and capability to confront primordial chaos established a theological precedent whose implications extended far beyond the specific narrative context of the Enuma Elish to inform broader patterns of thinking about divine supremacy and its cosmic foundations. The transformation of Marduk from city deity to supreme cosmic ruler required not merely the accumulation of epithets and powers, but the construction of an entire mythological framework that could explain and justify this unprecedented theological elevation. The founding myth that the Enuma Elish provided accomplished this task through narrative strategies that simultaneously acknowledged Marduk's relatively recent emergence while asserting his eternal supremacy, a paradox resolved through the theological claim that the younger god's authority derived from his unique capability to accomplish what the older gods could not achieve. The presentation of the elder deities as incapable of confronting Tiamat despite their prior existence and traditional authority established the dramatic context within which Marduk's superiority could be demonstrated, rather than merely asserted, his triumph over the primordial mother representing not usurpation of divine authority, but the legitimate acquisition of power through demonstrated competence. This narrative strategy addressed what must have been a significant theological problem for Babylonian religious thinkers, attempting to justify their city gods' elevation above deities, whose worship possessed far greater antiquity and geographical scope than the relatively recent cults centered at Babylon. The political dimensions of the Enuma Elish become apparent when one considers the historical context within which this text achieved its canonical form as the centerpiece of Babylonian religious celebration. The Kassite dynasty that ruled Babylon during the centuries following the collapse of the Old Babylonian period had particular reasons to promote Marduk's supremacy as a theological justification for their own political authority, their position as foreign rulers requiring ideological supports that could establish their legitimacy despite their non-native origins. The elevation of Marduk to supreme cosmic status provided precisely this legitimation, the god whose authority derived from demonstrated capability rather than mere ancestral priority, offering a template for political authority similarly based on effective governance rather than ethnic or dynastic continuity. The annual Akitu festival at which the Enuma Elish received its ceremonial recitation served as a regular reminder of these theological and political claims, the narrative's celebration of Marduk's triumph reinforcing both cosmic order and the political structures that claim derivation from this divine pattern. The relationship between mythological narrative and political ideology in ancient Mesopotamia extended beyond simple legitimation to encompass sophisticated theological claims about the nature of kingship and its cosmic foundations. The Enuma Elish's presentation of Marduk receiving kingship from the assembled gods established a paradigm for the divine foundation of political authority that found reflection in royal inscriptions and official propaganda throughout the period of Babylonian imperial expansion. The god who had saved the divine assembly from existential threat, and who had constructed the cosmos as an ordered dwelling place for both gods and humans, naturally possessed the authority to designate earthly rulers, and to grant them the power necessary for effective governance. This theological framework connected the specific political claims of Babylonian kings to the cosmic drama narrated in the creation epic, the annual renewal of creation through the Akitu festival, simultaneously renewing the king's divine mandate and the social order over which he presided. The cosmological sections of the Enuma Elish that describe Marduk's construction of the universe from Tiamat's divided body represent some of the most elaborate creation imagery preserved from ancient Mesopotamia, their detailed description of cosmic architecture establishing the ordered world within which both divine and human existence unfolds. The transformation of the defeated chaos monster into the structured components of the cosmos accomplished multiple theological purposes simultaneously, demonstrating both Marduk's creative power and the fundamental derivation of cosmic order from the conquest of primordial chaos. The sky formed from half of Tiamat's divided corpse, the earth from the other half, the celestial bodies stationed in their appointed courses, the rivers flowing from her pierced eyes, and the mountains raised from her breast together, constituted a cosmic geography, whose every feature testified to Marduk's ordering activity and the violent origins of the structured world. This imagery of creation through combat and dismemberment stands in notable contrast to the creation accounts preserved in other ancient Near Eastern traditions. Though scholars have identified structural parallels that suggest broader patterns of cosmogonic thinking shared across the region despite significant narrative differences. The creation of humanity within the Enuma Elish narrative serves a theological purpose quite distinct from the anthropocentric creation accounts familiar from later traditions. The text presenting human beings as created specifically to relieve the gods of labour and to provide for divine maintenance through cultic service. The suggestion to create humans emerges from the god Ea, though Marduk's authority sanctions and enables this creative act, the blood of the defeated Chingu, Tiamat's general and second husband, providing the material from which humanity is fashioned. This derivation of human existence from the substance of a condemned deity carries complex theological implications, connecting human nature to both divine origin and rebellious guilt in a combination that anticipates later theological elaborations upon human sinfulness and divine relationship. The purpose assigned to humanity within this mythological framework emphasizes service rather than dominion. The created beings existing to maintain the temples, provide the offerings, and perform the rituals through which divine favour was secured and cosmic order maintained. The institutional implications of this anthropological theology found concrete expression in the elaborate temple cultus that characterized Babylonian religious practice throughout the periods of imperial greatness. The Asagila temple complex that served as Marduk's earthly dwelling represented one of the most elaborate religious establishments of the ancient world, its daily rituals, seasonal festivals, and professional priesthoods requiring substantial economic resources and administrative coordination. The theological claim that human existence found its purpose in divine service provided ideological justification for the significant portion of Babylonian economic production that flowed toward temple establishments, the priests who administered these resources presenting themselves as facilitators of the cosmic service that maintained both divine favour and universal order. The economic and political power concentrated in temple institutions thus found theological legitimation in the creation mythology that assigned service as humanity's fundamental purpose, the boundary between religious ideology and institutional self-interest, proving impossible to disentangle from the perspective of later analysis. The strange complexity of Mesopotamian temple ritual emerges most clearly in the detailed descriptions of the Akitu festival preserved in various cuneiform sources, these texts revealing practices whose precise meanings remained subject to scholarly interpretation despite extensive analysis. The ritual humiliation of the king, who was required to set aside his royal insignia and submit to physical striking by the high priest before receiving renewed divine sanction for his rule, suggests theological claims about the conditional nature of political authority and its dependence upon divine approval that had implications extending far beyond the ceremonial context within which these rituals occurred. The procession of divine statues through the city streets, the formal recitation of the Enuma Elish, the determination of destiny for the coming year, and the sacred marriage ceremony that appears to have formed part of the festival complex together constituted an elaborate ritual program whose performance was believed essential for the maintenance of cosmic and political order. The relationship between the Akitu festival and the agricultural cycle has attracted scholarly attention as evidence for the connections between Mesopotamian religious practice and the economic realities of irrigated agriculture upon which Babylonian civilization depended. The festival's occurrence during the first month of the new year, which corresponded to the spring period when agricultural activity resumed following the winter pause, suggests connections between cosmic renewal and agricultural fertility that characterized religious thinking throughout the ancient Near East. The ritual determination of destinies performed during the festival addressed not only political matters but agricultural outcomes, the priests petitioning for adequate rainfall, successful irrigation, and bountiful harvests that would sustain both human populations and the divine establishments they served. This integration of cosmological mythology with agricultural concern reveals the practical dimensions of Mesopotamian religious thinking, the abstract theological claims about Marduk's supremacy finding concrete application in petitions for the material conditions upon which civilized existence depended. The theological developments that elevated Marduk to supreme status did not occur in isolation from broader patterns of religious evolution within ancient Mesopotamian civilization, their understanding requiring attention to the changing political and cultural contexts that shaped religious thinking across multiple centuries. The concentration of divine powers in increasingly comprehensive supreme deities represents a pattern observable not only in Babylon, but in various ancient Near Eastern contexts. This tendency toward henotheism or functional monotheism emerging under specific historical conditions, whose analysis illuminates the social functions served by particular theological configurations. The imperial contexts within which these developments typically occurred suggest connections between political centralization and theological concentration, the supremacy of a single deity providing cosmic validation for the authority of rulers whose power extended across traditionally distinct political and cultural regions. The Assyrian parallel to Marduk's elevation provides instructive comparison for understanding the relationship between political power and theological development in ancient Mesopotamia. The god Assur, originally the local deity of the city that bore his name and served as the core of the Assyrian state, underwent elevation to supreme status that paralleled and sometimes rivaled Marduk's position as the Neo-Assyrian Empire expanded to dominate the entire ancient Near East during the first millennium BCE. The Assyrian adaptation of the Enuma Elish that substituted Assur for Marduk in the role of cosmic champion reveals both the prestigious status that the Babylonian creation epic had achieved and the ideological flexibility that allowed mythological traditions to serve changing political circumstances. The rivalry between Babylonian and Assyrian theological claims during the period of Assyrian imperial dominance reflects broader political tensions between these related but competing centres of Mesopotamian civilization, the question of which deity properly occupied supreme cosmic position, carrying implications that extended far beyond abstract theological dispute. The persistence of Marduk's cult and theological prominence, despite periods of Babylonian political weakness and foreign domination, testifies to the deep roots that this worship had established within Babylonian cultural identity. The Kassite period saw the consolidation of Marduk's position. Despite the foreign origins of the ruling dynasty, these non-native rulers apparently recognizing the political utility of associating themselves with the indigenous religious traditions that commanded the loyalty of the Babylonian population. The subsequent Assyrian domination of Babylon produced religious tensions whose resolution varied according to the policies of individual Assyrian monarchs, some rulers treating Marduk's cult with careful respect, while others adopted more aggressive approaches that generated significant resentment among the Babylonian population. The famous removal of Marduk's cult statue from Babylon to Assyria by the king Sennacherib, an act that violated fundamental religious sensibilities and provoked lasting hostility, illustrates both the political significance attributed to control of this religious symbol and the risks involved in disregarding the religious sentiments associated with its proper veneration. The Neo-Babylonian period that followed Assyrian collapse saw the deliberate restoration and enhancement of Marduk's cult as a central element of the new dynasty's legitimation program, the kings who established Babylonian independence presenting themselves as restorers of proper divine worship that had suffered under foreign domination. Nebuchadnezzar II, whose reign represented the apex of Neo-Babylonian power, and whose building programs transformed Babylon into the magnificent city described by ancient observers, devoted particular attention to the Esagila temple complex and the religious establishments associated with Marduk's worship. The elaborate preparations for the Akitu festival, the maintenance of the ritual calendar, and the construction of the processional way along which the divine statues travelled during festival celebrations all received royal attention and resources that testified to the continuing centrality of Marduk's cult within Babylonian religious and political life. The theological claims articulated in the Enuma Elish thus found concrete expression in the monumental architecture and elaborate ritual programs that characterized Neo-Babylonian religious practice. The founding myth's assertions about Marduk's supremacy embodied in the physical and ceremonial structures through which this supremacy received its earthly expression. The final century of Babylonian independence produced religious developments whose interpretation remains contested among scholars examining the evidence for late Babylonian theological thinking. The tendency toward increased theological sophistication evident in texts from this period includes speculative treatments of divine nature, the relationship between different deities, and the cosmic functions attributed to Marduk that suggest continued evolution of the religious thinking, whose earlier phases had produced the Enuma Elish and related compositions. The identification of various gods with aspects of Marduk's comprehensive nature, already implicit in the 50 Names theology, received more explicit elaboration in texts that presented the traditional pantheon as consisting of functional aspects or manifestations of the supreme god, rather than genuinely distinct divine persons. This movement toward what some scholars have termed an incipient monotheism represents the logical extension of tendencies present within Babylonian religious thinking from earlier periods, though the degree to which these theological speculations influenced popular religious practice, as distinct from learned priestly reflection, remains difficult to determine from the available evidence. The Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE introduced new political and cultural influences that would eventually transform the religious landscape within which Marduk's cult had developed, though the immediate impact of Persian rule upon Babylonian religious institutions appears to have been relatively limited. The Persian policy of religious tolerance, exemplified in the famous Cyrus Cylinder's presentation of the Persian king as restorer of proper divine worship, allowed Babylonian religious establishments to continue their traditional activities under the new imperial administration. The Akitu festival continued to be celebrated, the Esagila temple remained in operation, and the cultic traditions associated with Marduk's worship persisted throughout the Achaemenid period, despite the fundamental transformation of political authority that Persian conquest had accomplished. The gradual decline of these institutions over subsequent centuries reflected not violent suppression, but the slow erosion of cultural contexts that had sustained Mesopotamian religious practice. The replacement of cuneiform writing by alphabetic scripts and the spread of new religious orientations, eventually accomplishing what military conquest had not achieved in eliminating the living tradition of Marduk's worship. The significance of Marduk's theological development for understanding broader patterns of religious evolution extends beyond the specific Mesopotamian context to illuminate fundamental questions about the nature of divine characterization and its relationship to social and political organization. The concentration of divine attributes in a single supreme deity, the subordination of previously independent gods to this central figure's authority, and the construction of mythological narratives justifying these theological claims represent patterns that would recur in various forms across subsequent religious history, whether through direct historical influence or the operation of similar pressures, producing similar theological solutions across different cultural contexts. The 50 names that encoded Marduk's comprehensive supremacy, the combat mythology that demonstrated his unique capability to confront primordial chaos, and the founding narrative that explained Babylon's position as center of cosmic order together constituted a theological achievement whose implications extended far beyond the specific historical circumstances within which these developments occurred. The question of direct influence upon later monotheistic traditions, particularly the Israelite religion, that developed in contexts of significant Mesopotamian cultural contact, remains among the most contested issues in the comparative study of ancient Near Eastern religion. The Babylonian exile that brought Judean religious leaders into direct contact with Babylonian religious culture occurred during the final period of Neo-Babylonian greatness, when Marduk's cult had achieved its most elaborate institutional expression, and the theological claims articulated in the Enuma Elish commanded widespread acceptance throughout the Babylonian cultural sphere. The biblical texts that emerge from this period and its immediate aftermath display complex relationships to Mesopotamian religious traditions, incorporating imagery, vocabulary, and structural patterns that suggest familiarity with Babylonian religious concepts, while simultaneously asserting theological claims that stood in fundamental tension with Mesopotamian presuppositions about divine plurality and cosmic order. The precise nature of these relationships, whether borrowing, rejection, transformation, or independent parallel development, admits no simple characterization and continues to generate scholarly discussion whose resolution depends upon interpretive decisions about the limited textual evidence that has survived from these formative periods. The parallels between Babylonian theological developments and Israelite monotheistic claims present themselves most strikingly in the treatment of creation mythology and the characterization of divine supremacy over cosmic forces. The Genesis creation narrative, though differing fundamentally from the Enuma Elish in its theological assumptions and literary presentation, nonetheless engages with conceptual frameworks that Mesopotamian religious thinking had developed over centuries of reflection upon the origins of cosmic order. The Hebrew term tehom, designating the primordial deep over which divine creative activity occurred, bears unmistakable linguistic relationship to the Akkadian Tiamat, the primordial waters whose defeat constituted the central action of Babylonian creation mythology. This linguistic connection, while not necessarily indicating direct literary dependence, demonstrates the shared conceptual vocabulary within which Israelite and Babylonian religious thinking operated, the common inheritance of ancient Near Eastern cosmological assumptions that both traditions developed according to their distinctive theological orientations. The transformation of Tiamat from active divine antagonist to passive primordial element in the Hebrew creation account reflects the systematic theological difference between Babylonian cosmic combat mythology and Israelite assumptions about uncontested divine sovereignty, the elimination of genuine divine conflict from the creation narrative serving to emphasize the absolute character of the single creator deity's authority over all existence. The relationship between divine speech and creative action presents another point of significant parallel between Babylonian and Israelite theological developments. The conception of divine utterance as possessing inherent efficacy that accomplishes its intentions without need for physical implementation, appearing in both traditions though receiving different emphases and applications. The Enuma Elish's demonstration of Marduk's supreme capability through the verbal destruction and recreation of the constellation represented a sophisticated theology of divine speech that attributed cosmogonic power to properly constituted verbal acts, the word of the supreme god possessing effectiveness that transcended the limitations governing ordinary speech and action. The Genesis narrative's systematic presentation of creation through divine speech, the repeated formula of divine utterance followed by its immediate realization, developed similar assumptions about the creative power of divine language while eliminating the context of divine conflict within which Babylonian theology had situated these claims. The theological development evident in both traditions represents elaboration upon assumptions about the relationship between divine intention and cosmic reality that constituted fundamental features of ancient Near Eastern religious thinking. The conception of divine speech as operative rather than merely descriptive, reflecting metaphysical commitments about the nature of ultimate reality and its responsiveness to properly constituted divine authority. The question of divine image and human responsibility presents perhaps the most theologically significant point of parallel between Babylonian and Israelite religious conceptions. The understanding of humanity's relationship to divine authority finding expression in both traditions through imagery of representation and delegation. The Mesopotamian tradition's understanding of the king as divine image, the representative of divine authority responsible for maintaining proper cosmic order within the human realm, established conceptual patterns that would receive transformed application in Israelite theological anthropology. The Genesis narrative's extension of image language from royal ideology to characterize humanity as such. The conception of human beings generally rather than kings specifically as created in divine image and charged with dominion over created order represented a democratization of royal theological categories that fundamentally transformed their social and religious implications while preserving the underlying conception of humanity as bearing special relationship to divine authority and cosmic responsibility. The theological significance of this transformation extended beyond anthropological speculation to encompass fundamental claims about the nature of legitimate authority and the relationship between divine sovereignty and human social organization, the elimination of special royal mediation between divine and human realms, carrying implications for the understanding of both political authority and individual moral responsibility. The development of Israelite monotheistic claims during and after the Babylonian exile occurred within contexts of direct exposure to the most sophisticated forms of Babylonian religious thinking. The theological reflection that produced the classical formulations of Jewish monotheism taking place among communities that had experienced Babylonian religious culture at first hand, and could not avoid engagement with its intellectual and spiritual claims. The prophetic literature associated with the exile period displays consistent polemic against Babylonian religious practices, particularly the worship of images and the claims made for the power and authority of Babylonian deities. This polemic serving both to maintain communal identity against assimilative pressures and to articulate positive theological claims about the nature of the one true deity over against Babylonian assumptions about divine plurality. The mockery of idol worship that characterizes exilic prophetic literature, the satirical treatment of manufacturing processes by which divine images were produced, and the logical difficulties of worshipping objects made by human hands represents engagement with Babylonian religious practice at its most visible level, while simultaneously developing theological arguments about the nature of genuine divinity that transcended the specific Mesopotamian context to establish principles applicable to religious evaluation generally. The transformation of Babylonian religious concepts through their incorporation into Israelite theological frameworks illustrates the complex processes by which religious traditions interact, borrow and transform materials from surrounding cultures, while maintaining distinctive theological orientations that fundamentally alter the significance of shared elements. The combat mythology that Babylonian tradition had developed to explain Marduk's supremacy found transformed expression in various Israelite texts that applied similar imagery to Yahweh's sovereignty over cosmic forces, the defeat of sea monsters and the subjugation of primordial chaos appearing in poetic and prophetic literature as demonstrations of the Israelite deity's supreme power. These applications occurred within theological frameworks that excluded the possibility of genuine divine conflict, the cosmic forces subdued by Yahweh appearing not as independent deities capable of challenging divine supremacy, but as creatures subject to the authority of the one true God, whose power over all existence admitted no genuine opposition. The transformation illustrates how similar mythological patterns could receive fundamentally different theological interpretations, depending upon the presuppositions within which they were situated. The imagery of cosmic combat serving in Israelite context to emphasize divine supremacy in ways that excluded rather than presupposed the divine plurality that Babylonian interpretations had assumed. The theological concept of divine uniqueness that characterizes classical Israelite monotheism developed through processes of reflection and controversy that engaged directly with the religious claims of surrounding cultures, particularly the sophisticated theological systems that Babylonian religious thinking had produced. The explicit assertions of Yahweh's sole divinity that appear in exilic and post-exilic prophetic literature, the categorical denial that other beings worshipped as gods possessed genuine divine status, represented theological positions that required engagement with alternative claims about divine nature and cosmic order. The development of these monotheistic assertions from earlier Israelite religion, which appears to have acknowledged the existence of other deities while maintaining exclusive loyalty to Yahweh as Israel's particular deity, involved theological transformations whose relationship to exposure to Babylonian religious thinking during the exile period remains subject to scholarly debate. Some interpreters have suggested that encounter with Marduk's comprehensive supremacy, the concentration of divine functions in a single supreme deity that Babylonian theology had accomplished, provided conceptual resources that Israelite thinkers could appropriate and transform according to their distinctive theological orientations, the example of monolatrous tendencies within Mesopotamian religion facilitating the development of fully monotheistic claims within Israelite tradition. The institutional context within which these theological developments occurred differed significantly between Babylonian and Israelite traditions. The temple-centered priestly establishments that produced and transmitted Babylonian religious knowledge, operating according to principles and serving social functions, that contrasted with the prophetic and scribal traditions through which Israelite theology developed. The Babylonian priesthood's role in maintaining cosmic order through proper ritual performance, the conception of human religious activity as essential to the functioning of divine cosmic processes that affected both gods and humans, established frameworks for understanding religious obligation that differed fundamentally from Israelite assumptions about the nature of divine-human relationship. The prophetic tradition's emphasis upon moral and social dimensions of religious fidelity, the conception of proper worship as encompassing ethical behavior and social justice, rather than primarily ritual performance, represented theological orientations that distinguished Israelite religion from Mesopotamian patterns while developing in contexts of awareness of and engagement with those patterns. The transformation of religious concepts through their reinterpretation according to different theological frameworks illustrates how traditions sharing common cultural heritage could develop in directions that produced fundamentally different religious systems while retaining traces of their shared origins in vocabulary, imagery, and conceptual structures. The persistence of Babylonian religious concepts beyond the institutional context that had originally sustained them occurred through multiple channels of transmission that carried Mesopotamian religious thinking into subsequent cultural developments. The astronomical and astrological traditions that Babylonian temple establishments had developed achieved extensive distribution throughout the ancient Mediterranean world during the Hellenistic period, carrying with them theological assumptions about cosmic order and divine influence that shaped religious thinking in contexts far removed from their Mesopotamian origins. The conception of celestial bodies as divine or as vehicles of divine influence, the systematic correlation of astronomical phenomena with earthly events and human destinies, represented elements of Babylonian religious thinking that achieved remarkable persistence through their incorporation into astrological traditions that continued to develop long after Mesopotamian religious institutions had ceased to function. The divine names and associations that Babylonian astronomy had established, the correlation of planets with specific deities whose characteristics influenced their astrological significance, preserved traces of Mesopotamian divine characterization within frameworks that transformed their original theological context while maintaining conceptual continuities with their origins. The relationship between divine supremacy and cosmic order that Marduk's mythology had established found various forms of continuation in religious and philosophical traditions that developed throughout the ancient world during centuries following Babylon's decline as independent political and cultural centre. The conception of a supreme organising principle responsible for the ordered structure of the cosmos, whether understood in personal or impersonal terms, appeared in Greek philosophical traditions that developed during periods of extensive contact with Near Eastern cultures and their accumulated religious and cosmological speculation. The relationship between these philosophical developments and Mesopotamian religious thinking remains difficult to specify with precision. The multiple channels through which cultural exchange occurred and the transformations that concepts underwent during transmission, complicating any simple account of influence or derivation. What can be observed is the persistence of certain conceptual patterns, the correlation of supreme authority with cosmic ordering activity, and the understanding of the universe as reflecting rational principles susceptible to human comprehension in traditions that emerged from the broader cultural context within which Mesopotamian religious and cosmological thinking had developed over millennia. The Stoic conception of a divine logos pervading and ordering cosmic processes, the understanding of the universe as expressing rational principles that constituted both its structural foundation and its ongoing governance, bore conceptual resemblances to aspects of Mesopotamian religious thinking that had attributed cosmic ordering functions to supreme divine authority. The philosophical transformation of these concepts eliminated the mythological frameworks within which Mesopotamian theology had developed its claims about divine supremacy, replacing narrative accounts of divine action with systematic reflection upon the rational principles underlying cosmic order. The extent to which these philosophical developments drew upon Mesopotamian precedents directly, or represented independent reflection upon common problems of cosmic explanation, admits no definitive resolution, given the complexity of cultural transmission in the ancient world and the multiple possible sources from which similar conclusions might have been derived. The conceptual patterns themselves, however, the correlation of supreme authority with rational cosmic order, and the understanding of human reason as capable of apprehending the principles governing universal structure, represent continuities with assumptions that Mesopotamian religious thinking had articulated through its distinctive mythological and theological forms. The development of later monotheistic traditions in the ancient Near Eastern Mediterranean world occurred within cultural contexts saturated with religious concepts and cosmological assumptions that Mesopotamian civilization had helped to shape over centuries of cultural influence and exchange. The emergence of Christianity from Jewish monotheistic foundations incorporated the transformed Mesopotamian elements that Israelite religious development had already processed while adding new layers of theological elaboration that would produce distinctive claims about divine nature and cosmic purpose. the conception of divine combat with forces of chaos and evil that appears in various forms throughout Christian theological development, the understanding of cosmic history as involving fundamental conflict between divine purposes and opposing powers, preserved transformed elements of the combat mythology that Babylonian religion had employed to explain Marduk's supremacy. The elimination of genuine divine opposition, the understanding of evil powers as created beings in rebellion against, rather than rivals of divine authority, transformed the theological significance of combat imagery while preserving its narrative power and its function in explaining the existence of opposition to divine purposes within a cosmos created and governed by supreme divine authority. The Islamic tradition's development of monotheistic claims within contexts of awareness of both Jewish and Christian precedents incorporated assumptions about divine nature and cosmic order that represented the culmination of centuries of theological development building upon ancient Near Eastern foundations. The absolute transcendence and unity emphasized in Islamic theology, the categorical rejection of any attribution to the supreme deity of characteristics that might suggest limitation or plurality, represented the most thoroughgoing development of monotheistic principles that had emerged through the long history of religious reflection upon divine supremacy in the ancient Near East. The 99 beautiful names of Allah in Islamic tradition, the systematic enumeration of divine attributes that characterize the supreme deity's relationship to creation and humanity, bore structural resemblance to the 50 names theology that had constituted the theological core of Marduk's characterization in Babylonian religion. Though the conceptual content and theological significance of these enumerations differed according to the distinctive frameworks within which they developed, the pattern of comprehensive divine characterization through systematic enumeration of attributes and functions, the conception of the supreme deity as possessing all perfections and exercising all legitimate authorities represented a structural feature of supreme God theology that persisted across the transformations from Mesopotamian to Israelite to Christian to Islamic religious development. The comparative study of these theological traditions reveals both the persistence of certain conceptual patterns across religious and cultural boundaries and the fundamental transformations that these patterns underwent as they were appropriated and developed according to different theological frameworks and social contexts. The concentration of divine attributes in a single supreme deity, accomplished in Babylonian religion through the systematic subordination of traditional pantheon members and the attribution of their functions to Marduk, found different expression in monotheistic traditions that denied the genuine divine status of any beings other than the one true God while preserving the conception of divine supremacy that Mesopotamian religion had elaborated through henotheistic rather than strictly monotheistic means. The mythological narratives that had justified Marduk's supremacy through accounts of his unique capability to confront primordial chaos gave way to theological claims about divine transcendence and creative sovereignty that eliminated the context of genuine divine conflict, while preserving the association between supreme authority and cosmic ordering activity. The institutional foundations that had sustained Marduk's cult, the temple establishments and festival celebrations that had given concrete expression to theological claims about divine supremacy, found no direct continuation in traditions that developed different forms of religious organization and different understandings of the relationship between cultic performance and cosmic order. The strange parallels between Marduk's theological characterization and the attributes of later monotheistic supreme beings thus reflect both historical connections and the operation of similar pressures, producing similar theological solutions across different cultural contexts. The concentration of supreme authority, the attribution of cosmic ordering functions, the development of comprehensive characterizations encompassing all divine perfections, and the construction of narratives explaining and justifying these claims represent patterns that appear repeatedly in the history of supreme God theology, whether through direct historical transmission or the independent elaboration of similar responses to similar religious and social circumstances. The specific form that these patterns took in Babylonian religion, the 50 names theology, and the Enuma Elish mythology, and the festival celebrations that enacted and transmitted these claims, represented one historically significant development of tendencies present within ancient Near Eastern religious thinking generally, a development whose influence upon subsequent religious history extended far beyond the specific institutional context within which it originally emerged. The decline of those institutions, the gradual erosion of the cultural foundations that had sustained Mesopotamian religious practice, did not eliminate the conceptual patterns that Babylonian theology had developed, but rather released them to find new expressions in religious traditions that transformed their significance while preserving their structural features across the changing circumstances of subsequent religious history. The transformation of these theological patterns from their Babylonian institutional contexts to their expressions in subsequent religious traditions thus constitutes one of the most significant developments in the history of human religious thought, a development whose full implications become apparent only when traced through the extended trajectory of cultural and conceptual change that connected the ancient Near Eastern world to the religious formations that would dominate subsequent millennia. The persistence of supreme god theology across this trajectory, the survival of conceptual structures developed within Mesopotamian religious thinking long after the decline of the civilizations that had originally elaborated them, demonstrates the remarkable durability of certain theological patterns once they have achieved systematic articulation, their capacity to find new expressions within frameworks that may differ substantially from those within which they originally emerged. The specific theological achievement represented by Babylonian Marduk theology, the comprehensive systematization of divine supremacy through enumerated attributes and mythological justification and cultic celebration, constituted a model of supreme god characterization whose influence extended far beyond the geographical and temporal boundaries of Mesopotamian civilization itself. The final centuries of Babylon's independent existence witnessed both the culmination of Marduk theology and the beginning of its transformation into something other than what it had been within its original institutional contexts. The city that had served as the centre of Marduk's cult, the urban foundation whose political fortunes had risen and fallen with the elevation and displacement of its patron deity, continued to function as a religious centre of considerable importance even as political power shifted to other capitals and other empires. The temple establishment at Esagila, the priesthoods and ritual specialists who maintained the worship of Marduk, according to patterns that had been elaborated over more than a millennium of religious development, preserved the theological traditions that constituted the conceptual foundation of Babylonian religious identity, while adapting to the changed political circumstances that characterized the late periods of Mesopotamian history. The conquest of Babylon by Persian forces in 539 BCE, accomplished by Cyrus the Great through the exploitation of internal discontent and the presentation of Persian authority as favourable to traditional Babylonian religious institutions, marked a significant transition in the political framework within which Marduk theology operated, without immediately disrupting the cultic practices and theological formulations that had characterized his worship throughout the preceding centuries. The Persian rulers who succeeded to authority over Babylon demonstrated remarkable sensitivity to the religious traditions of their Mesopotamian subjects, presenting themselves as restorers and protectors of Marduk's cult, rather than as foreign conquerors imposing alien religious practices upon subject populations. The Cyrus cylinder, the propaganda inscription through which the Persian conqueror justified his assumption of power in Babylon, employed traditional Mesopotamian rhetorical forms and theological concepts in presenting the conquest as divinely sanctioned restoration of proper religious observance following the impieties of the defeated Babylonian king Nabonidus. The claim that Marduk had selected Cyrus as the instrument of his purposes, that the Persian king had been chosen by Babylon's supreme deity to restore proper cultic practices and rescue the city from rulers who had neglected their religious obligations, demonstrated the continued vitality of Marduk theology as a framework for legitimizing political authority even under circumstances of foreign conquest. The accommodation between Persian imperial administration and Babylonian religious institutions allowed the continuation of temple activities and festival celebrations throughout the Achaemenid period, preserving the cultic foundations of Marduk theology, while locating them within a political context substantially different from that of independent Babylonian rule. The gradual transformation of Babylonian religious culture under foreign rule nevertheless introduced changes whose cumulative effect would prove significant for the long-term trajectory of Marduk theology and its relationship to broader developments in religious thought. The emergence of Aramaic as the dominant spoken language of Mesopotamia, replacing the Akkadian that had served as the vehicle of Babylonian religious and literary tradition, created a growing distance between the linguistic forms of traditional religious texts and the everyday speech of the populations among whom these traditions were preserved. The temple establishments that maintained Marduk's cult continued to employ Akkadian and Sumerian for liturgical purposes, preserving the archaic linguistic forms through which theological concepts had been articulated, while the broader population increasingly communicated in languages that had no direct connection to these ancient traditions. This linguistic transformation, gradual and uneven across different social strata and geographical regions, contributed to the increasing specialization of traditional Mesopotamian religious knowledge within priestly circles, whose mastery of archaic languages and texts distinguished them from the broader populations nominally under their religious care. The conquest of Alexander the Great in 331 BCE introduced new dynamics into the already complex cultural situation of late Babylonian religion, bringing Mesopotamia within the sphere of Greek cultural influence while maintaining the institutional continuity of temple establishments that had survived previous transitions of political authority. The Seleucid rulers who succeeded to Alexander's Mesopotamian territories demonstrated varying degrees of interest in traditional Babylonian religious institutions, with some monarchs participating in Marduk's cult, and others showing indifference or even hostility to traditional religious practices. The foundation of new Greek cities, particularly Seleucia on the Tigris, drew population and economic activity away from Babylon itself, contributing to the gradual decline of the ancient city that had served as the centre of Marduk's cult throughout the long centuries of Mesopotamian religious development. The emergence of intellectual exchanges between Babylonian priestly traditions and Greek philosophical inquiry, documented through various ancient testimonies and modern scholarly reconstruction, created opportunities for the transmission of Mesopotamian religious concepts into the broader Mediterranean cultural sphere where they might influence subsequent religious and philosophical developments. The astronomical and astrological knowledge preserved within Babylonian temple establishments proved particularly attractive to Greek intellectual inquiry, facilitating the transmission of Mesopotamian scientific and religious concepts through channels that connected the declining world of traditional Mesopotamian religion to the emerging intellectual cultures of the Hellenistic age. The association between celestial observation and theological reflection that had characterized Babylonian religion from its earliest periods found new expressions in the astrological traditions that spread throughout the Hellenistic world, carrying with them conceptual frameworks and observational techniques that had been developed within Mesopotamian temple contexts. The identification of planets with deities, the conception of celestial movements as expressions of divine activity and determinants of terrestrial events, the systematic correlation of heavenly phenomena with earthly affairs that characterized developed Babylonian astrology, entered the broader Mediterranean cultural sphere through these transmission processes, influencing subsequent religious and philosophical developments in ways that extended the conceptual legacy of Babylonian religion far beyond its original geographical and institutional boundaries. The gradual decline of Babylon as an urban centre and the corresponding erosion of the institutional foundations that had sustained Marduk's cult proceeded unevenly across the centuries following Alexander's conquest, with temple activities continuing in diminished form long after the city had ceased to function as a significant political or economic centre. The cuneiform tablets that preserve records of late Babylonian religious activity document the persistence of traditional practices into the first centuries of the Common Era, with astronomical observations and ritual activities continuing within temple context, even as the broader cultural foundations of Mesopotamian civilization crumbled around these institutional remnants. The final abandonment of cuneiform writing, the extinction of the scribal traditions that had preserved Mesopotamian religious and literary heritage across more than 3 millennia, marked the definitive conclusion of the institutional framework within which Marduk theology had achieved its classical formulations, leaving only the indirect traces and transmitted influences through which Babylonian religious concepts would persist within subsequent traditions. The transformation of Marduk from active recipient of ongoing cultic worship to historical phenomenon known primarily through ancient texts and archaeological remains represented a significant transition in the mode of his existence within human religious consciousness, a transition from living deity whose worship shaped the religious experiences of actual populations to cultural memory whose significance lay in historical influence rather than present devotion. The knowledge of Babylonian religion that survived into later periods came increasingly through second-hand reports and fragmentary traditions rather than through direct continuation of religious practice, preserving certain elements of Mesopotamian theological thinking while losing the cultic context that had given these elements their original significance. The accounts of Babylonian religion preserved in Greek and Roman sources, the scattered references in biblical and later Jewish texts, the indirect transmissions through astrological and magical traditions that carried Mesopotamian concepts into new cultural contexts, constituted the channels through which knowledge of Marduk and his theological significance passed into periods that no longer maintained direct institutional connection with the civilization that had originally developed his cult. The rediscovery of Mesopotamian civilization through 19th century archaeological investigation and the subsequent decipherment of cuneiform writing restored direct access to the primary sources of Babylonian religious thinking, allowing modern scholarship to reconstruct the theological systems and mythological narratives that had constituted the conceptual foundation of Marduk's cult. The recovery of the Enuma Elish through the excavation of Nineveh's library remains. The reconstruction of the 50 Names theology and the Akitu festival procedures and the broader framework of Babylonian religious practice provided unprecedented insight into a religious tradition that had been largely forgotten during the long centuries between the extinction of cuneiform culture and the modern recovery of its textual heritage. The scholarly investigation of Babylonian religion that developed throughout the 20th century and continues into the present established the foundations for systematic comparison between Mesopotamian theological concepts and the religious traditions that succeeded them, illuminating both the historical connections and the structural parallels that link Marduk theology to subsequent developments in supreme god characterization. The significance of Marduk's theological career for understanding the broader history of monotheistic development lies not in any direct causal relationship between Babylonian religion and later monotheisms, but in the illumination that Mesopotamian materials provide for understanding the conceptual processes through which supreme god theologies emerge and develop within their cultural contexts. The transformation of Marduk from minor city deity to supreme cosmic authority, accomplished through the systematic attribution of other gods' functions and the construction of mythological narratives justifying his elevated status, represents a particularly well-documented instance of theological processes that appear repeatedly in the history of religion, the concentration of divine attributes, and the development of comprehensive characterizations that distinguish supreme deities from the other divine beings within their religious contexts. The 50 Names theology that constituted the theoretical foundation of Marduk's supremacy, the systematic enumeration of attributes and functions that portrayed him as encompassing all divine perfections, provided a model of supreme god characterization whose structural features would find analogous expression in religious traditions that developed according to different theological frameworks and within different cultural circumstances. The relationship between political consolidation and theological centralization that characterized Marduk's rise to supremacy illuminates patterns that appear throughout the history of religious development, the tendency for political unification to encourage or require corresponding religious unification that concentrates divine authority in ways paralleling the concentration of political power, the elevation of Marduk under Hammurabi and his successors, the systematic subordination of traditional Sumerian and Akkadian deities to Babylon's patron god, reflected the political processes through which Babylonian hegemony was established over previously independent city-states, creating religious structures that expressed and legitimized political relationships. The subsequent history of Marduk theology, its persistence across periods of Babylonian political weakness, and its revival under later dynasties that restored Babylonian independence, demonstrates the complex relationships between political circumstances and religious development, the capacity of theological systems to survive political transformations, while also responding to changed circumstances through modifications of emphasis and interpretation. The mythological narratives that justified Marduk's supremacy, particularly the Enuma Elish account of his victory over Tiamat and his subsequent establishment of cosmic order, represent theological achievements whose significance extends beyond their specific cultural contexts to illuminate broader patterns in the construction of supreme god mythologies. The association between supreme authority and the conquest of primordial chaos, the conception of the highest deity as the one who established order against disorder and maintains that order through ongoing sovereign activity, appears repeatedly in religious traditions that may have no direct historical connection to Babylonian precedents, suggesting the operation of similar theological pressures producing similar mythological solutions across different cultural circumstances. The specific form that this association took in Babylonian mythology, the elaborate narrative of divine assembly and cosmic combat and creative ordering that constituted the Enuma Elish, provided one influential model for supreme god mythology whose echoes appear in various subsequent religious traditions, whether through direct transmission or independent development of similar theological patterns. The strange parallels between Marduk's theological characterization and the attributes of later monotheistic supreme beings thus reflect both the historical circumstances that connected Mesopotamian religious thinking to subsequent traditions and the recurrence of similar conceptual patterns across the broader history of religious development. The concentration of divine authority in a single supreme figure, the attribution of cosmic creative and ordering functions to this supreme deity, the development of comprehensive characterizations encompassing all divine perfections, and the construction of narratives explaining and justifying these claims represent patterns whose appearance in multiple religious traditions suggests something fundamental about the dynamics of supreme god theology itself, the tendencies inherent in religious reflection upon divine supremacy to produce certain characteristic formulations regardless of the specific cultural contexts within which this reflection occurs. The Babylonian development of these patterns, accomplished through the specific circumstances of Mesopotamian political and religious history, constitutes one historically significant instance of processes whose operation can be traced across the broader comparative study of religious traditions. The legacy of Marduk thus extends far beyond the specific institutional contexts within which his worship was originally conducted, encompassing the conceptual contributions that Babylonian theology made to the broader development of supreme god thinking in human religious history. The 50 names, the enumerated attributes that characterized Marduk as encompassing all divine perfections, provided a model of comprehensive divine characterization whose structural features would persist across the transformations that carried ancient Near Eastern religious concepts into monotheistic traditions, maintaining fundamentally different theological frameworks. The mythological narratives that portrayed Marduk as the conqueror of chaos and the establisher of cosmic order associated supreme authority with functions that would remain central to supreme god characterization in subsequent religious traditions, even as the specific mythological forms through which these associations were expressed underwent fundamental transformation. The institutional patterns through which Marduk's supremacy was enacted and celebrated, the festival observances and temple establishments that gave concrete expression to theological claims, represented religious structures whose basic principles would find modified expression in traditions that developed different forms of cultic organization while preserving certain underlying patterns of religious practice. The journey from minor patron of an obscure Mesopotamian city to supreme cosmic authority, whose theological characteristics would influence subsequent religious development across millennia, represents one of the remarkable transformations in the history of human religious thought, a transformation whose full significance becomes apparent only when traced through the extended trajectory connecting ancient Babylon to the religious traditions that would shape subsequent human experience. The rise of Marduk from his origins as one deity among many within the crowded Mesopotamian pantheon to his eventual status as the supreme god whose characteristics encompassed all divine perfections and whose authority extended over all realms of existence, demonstrates the capacity of religious traditions to undergo fundamental transformation while maintaining continuity with their established heritage, adapting inherited concepts and practices to changed circumstances through processes of reinterpretation and systematic elaboration. The strange persistence of certain theological patterns across the vast transformations that separated Babylonian henotheism from developed monotheism, the continued appearance of comprehensive divine characterizations and cosmic ordering narratives and enumerated attribute theologies in traditions that differed fundamentally in their understanding of divine nature and religious obligation, testifies to the durability of conceptual structures once they have achieved systematic articulation within influential religious traditions. The figure who had risen from the marshes of southern Mesopotamia to become the supreme deity of Babylonian religion, whose 50 names proclaimed his encompassing of all divine perfections, and whose mythological triumph over primordial chaos established the paradigm for divine sovereignty, ultimately transcended the specific cultural circumstances of his origin to contribute patterns and possibilities to the broader development of human religious thinking. the concentration of supreme authority, the systematic attribution of cosmic functions, the comprehensive enumeration of divine attributes, and the mythological justification of sovereign claims represent conceptual achievements, whose influence extended far beyond the institutional context within which they were originally elaborated, finding new expressions in religious traditions that transformed their significance while preserving their structural features across the changing circumstances of subsequent religious history. Marduk of Babylon, the city god elevated to cosmic supremacy through the systematic appropriation of other deities' functions and the construction of narratives portraying him as the unique source of cosmic order, had demonstrated possibilities for supreme god theology that would continue to shape religious development long after the temples of Esagila had crumbled and the festivals celebrating his triumph had ceased to be observed, leaving as his enduring legacy not the continuation of his specific cult, but the contribution of conceptual patterns to the ongoing human endeavour of understanding and characterising ultimate divine reality.